Okay, hello, welcome to the channel. I'm going to try and make this one a fairly quick one, but there are a ton of snapping options, so I'll be going through it quick, but I'm not sure how long the actual video will be. I'm on Blender 2.8. It is in beta at the moment, but I think the UI has been locked down now, and it's probably not going to change very much. So everything pretty much should be fairly similar from the UI side. I'm sure they're just fixing bugs and stuff, getting ready for a final release now. But we're talking about snapping. And this is intended to be like a full snapping overview, whereas the options that we're going to be looking at are all up at the top middle here. The key thing when you're looking at snapping is probably the actual snapping drop down menu, but that's not how most people think of snapping. Certainly in terms of just other stuff like being able to flatten objects and stuff like that, or being able to flatten a plane that's made out of a few other vertices, you know, stuff like that can be quite tricky. So we're going to do like a complete snapping guide. I'm going to start off by saying stuff to do with the cursor here, because that's kind of interesting. I did see someone else using that and it's pretty cool, because you can do some cool stuff with it, and what I'm going to do with it is just going to start using the snapping options from the top down. So we can start off by seeing when I move it, it's freely moving with my cursor, and that's just how, you know, I can place it wherever I want. And that's pretty cool. But if I wanted to spawn, say, an object at this corner here, which this box lines up with the grid, so if I want to spawn it in this corner here, I can turn on my snapping, and now we can see that it's just snapping all over the place. Although what you'll notice is I can't get it to hit that corner there. So I'm going to press Shift S for my snapping options, which allows me to move things around to the cursor location. I'm just going to turn on screencast keys here so that you know what I'm doing, so you can see my buttons on the bottom right there. And basically, yeah, no, I can't line this up with that corner because I had it in a position before I turned on snapping. I had it in a random position, and then I've turned snapping on and I can no longer snap it exactly to this grid, which can be a problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap this cursor, which is all down the bottom here, by pressing Shift S. I can snap the cursor to some different things. At the moment most of these are sort of the same thing, you know, because if I snap it to my active, it's going to be this cube, and the center of this cube is at 0, 0, 0. So if I snapped it to selected, then it's still going to be this cube. If I had multiple objects, and I've got two of them selected now, this one here, or let's choose this one. This one up here is my active, so I'm going to snap this to active, and it's going to move to my final selected one with this lighter outline. But I'm going to snap this to the world origin, which again is 0, 0, 0, which just happens to be where this cube is, the basic cube that we spawn, and also cursor to grid, which is going to actually probably do what we want, but it's a bit unpredictable. It's going to move, you know, so that has moved it to the closest point in the grid. But if I move it over here and I snap to grid, then it's gonna move it to the closest point on the grid, which does help. And I don't use that very often, so I didn't really consider that to be an option, because what we're going to do is to get it to get to that grid position, rather than just snapping it back to the world origin and then moving it, which clearly doesn't work because when you click you're moving it anyway. What we're going to do is say on this drop down, hit the absolute to grid snap. So now I'm getting it on exactly where the grid points intersect, as you can see here. The grid is just a plane, so sometimes there's perspective issues there. So right now it's like way up in the air, so obviously I can move it and it looks like it's not on the grid. It's moving on the grid within, like, imagine it as a 3D grid. But that's not the most, you know, I don't snap things to the grid that often, because sometimes I'm creating objects that are, you know, 100% within the grid space, but most of the time I'm not. I need to get a little bit more, well, a little bit better, closer than that and stuff. So you can go to the side view by pressing 3 on the number pad, or front view, or top view, and you'll see that this grid now is divided into more pieces in orthographic in orthographic view by hitting 5, and these are grid points now. So you can see that I've got a much finer snapping distance, and then if I zoom in even further, that grid divides even more, and I can, you know, snap things a lot more accurately, and that's just snapping to the increment. I'm going to stop using this magnet button. You can use that to turn the grid snapping on and off, but what I prefer to do is, say when I'm holding down my left mouse button to move this, rather than have snapping on, I prefer to just hold Control. So you can see down there on the bottom right where my screencast keys are, that I'm holding Control and left mouse button, and that is allowing me to snap to wherever I want. And then at any point I can say, right, well, you know, I've got the snap position, and now I'm going to be moving it freely and straight back to the snaps by holding Control and letting go, which is useful sometimes, rather than hitting that button that has it on constantly. So Vertex Snapping, we'll use 2 objects for this. Duplicating, moving it over. And Vertex Snapping, it can be more useful in a position where things are just, obviously you're creating things more naturally, you're not going to be keeping it to the grid all the time. So I pretty much have it on Vertex Snapping by default. I don't often go over and use the increment snapping. And we've got a few options here. So you can try and move it, so you can move it just in the same way and snap it, and it's going to pick a point out of, so I've selected this edge here, and when I'm trying to snap it, it's going to move, as is defined here, it's going to move the closest, and it's going to snap it right to that vertex that we are targeting. And that's pretty cool, but I don't commonly want that either. If I wanted to move that vertex to this position, then I'd kind of want these 2 things to be the same mesh, if they're like that close together. In most cases, but you can also change to the center point, which is going to move it. As you can see, that vertex now is in the center point. Median, which I'm guessing is alright. Well, I'm not sure how that one's worked out, because I don't really know what the median of the object is, of the selection. And active, which is the same as before, it's the final one you select, right now outlined in white. As you see, that one's blue. On yours it'll be orange. I just accidentally made it blue. But the one that's white or highlighted slightly differently, as you see, I select all of these. That one's white now, it's the last one that I selected, and the other 3 are not. So if I was going to move this, and I had this one selected last, and I snap this, it's going to snap that one. If I select this one last, and I snap this, it's going to snap it on the other one. If that makes sense. But I pretty much keep that one closest. And what I'm going to do is, as I say, I'm not commonly going to want to snap this like that. I mean, that's destroyed my shape, right? But what I might want more often is just to snap it on one axis. So rather than hitting G and just snapping it, I'll hit G and I'll limit it just to say the Y axis, right? So now I'm limited and I want to say, well, I do want this to be in line with that. So now I've got it perfectly in line by snapping it in position of that object. But it's not at the same height, so I can move it on the Z axis now by pressing G and then Z. And now it's absolutely perfectly in line with these ones and those ones. And that's more commonly what I'd want when I'm snapping. And just a quick way of doing that, rather than doing it one axis at a time, if it is a uniform, you know, if this cube isn't rotated at some random angle, then you can press G and hold Shift and X, which is going to put it on two axes, but not the one that you press. So Shift X is saying don't move on the X, Shift Z is saying don't move on the Z axis, and Shift Y is saying don't move on the Y axis. I want it to move on Shift X, sorry. And when I snap this now, it's automatically snapped to a good position. I'd be interested just to try rotating this and maybe just moving it to the side and just saying try and do the same thing. So we've moved it sort of around. And the reason for this is because now that I've rotated it, the object rotation is still stored as a local space sort of thing. So you can bring up this, which is in the world space right now. As you see, it's in global. But we can change that to local, and now we can see that our X position is pointing, you know, in the original position, right? So if I move this on the Y-axis now, then I can still snap that, presumably, to the same sort of positions, but on a different axis, right? So if things are uniform, if you haven't like applied to transforms and stuff like that, then you can still snap things on those axes, and you don't even have to change it to local. You can actually just, if I rotate this again, rather than changing to local, you actually have both of them as an option to you by default. You can just press, if I grab this and I want to move it on the x-axis, like we were before, which would be, you know, not like that, that's ruining my shape, then I just hit X twice, and now I'm moving it along that. And I hit Y twice, and I'm moving it along the local Y-axis. I hit Z twice, and well, I mean Z either way was the same anyway, so that doesn't matter. And that can be cool for snapping as well, because if I want to snap this on just that axis and bring it in line with that, then that's pretty cool, and I can do that. If I wanted to do some other things there, I'm not going to go through them all, but you can do it with the normal, local normal, which is probably more useful when you've got a face. So hit normal, and it's going to say, it's easy to bring on the move tool, and now it's doing, you know, every face is doing a Z-axis there, so, you know, because the Z's pointing outwards, which is cool too. I'll undo all this, or I'll just add a new cube and we'll set up a new example as we keep moving on. So I'm going to snap the cursor back to the center there and add a new cube. I think that's most of it. I never use this align rotation to tangent, and I'll skip that until I get to the face part of it, because there's so much. Although edges, it's pretty much the same thing, but say if I add another cube, which is in the same position, you know, it's kind of harder, it's less accurate, but if I grab this vertex now, I can just sort of just move it all the way around the object and snap it to the edges. Pretty cool. I don't use it that often, not as much as vertices or face snapping. I don't often snap to the edge as much, because usually the vertices line up just to where I want them to be, where I want the objects to be, and if not, then I don't really care where the edges are, because maybe the mesh has too many edges, so I just tend to snap things to the face instead. So we'll move on to actually I'll just quickly mention this stuff at the bottom, because it's not just based on movement. So if I grab this now and I want to snap this to this position, rather than just pressing G and moving it, and obviously that's going to move both sides that way, which is not what I want. If I wanted to scale this and I hit Control now and try and snap it, then it's not going to work, because I have not selected scale. I never used the rotation one. So now when I'm scaling, it's registering that I want to snap it to that position, which is sometimes useful. Just sometimes when you have to close a gap, you're in very specific situations, you're scaling rather than moving, which can be pretty cool, very useful. And the reason I don't use the rotation snapping one is I don't know why you would mostly want to snap something on the rotation in Blender, whereas most software has the option for you to turn on like a slider that lets you rotate. You know, so if I got this tool here, the rotation tool, most software says you know, only rotate at 90 degrees at a time and all this sort of stuff, or limit it so that, you know, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. But for Blender there's no need for that, because I can hit R for rotate, do it on the Z axis, and then literally just type in 45. So now I've rotated that 45 degrees. So you don't snap rotations in the same way as other software, you know, because you can just directly type in while you're working. Obviously in other software you can type in the rotation, but you'd have to click over here and do it, and then you start typing in your stuff, and it's that's a bit slower than just rotating it with the widget, but it's also not as fast as rotating it just by hitting numbers, in my opinion. So that's pretty cool. It's all pretty cool. Face snapping, a little bit different, so I'm going to add in a different object, just something different, like the Blender monkey. Forgotten what the monkey was called. And I'm going to snap that down. I'm going to snap the cursor down here, which is going to be helpful for just setting the origin to the 3D cursor instead of just moving it down there or anything like that. That's how that's generally done. And if I turn on face snapping, which it is on, then I can snap the active position to the surface of this cube, which works pretty well, but I don't want to always do that, so I'm going to keep it on active at the moment, and then I'm going to hit this checkbox here, which is align rotation, which is, I only use this on the face mode really, but you can use it on other modes. And as you can see now, it's taking that normal rotation and it's aligning that object, which is very useful for just sticking things to the object and getting it properly in line. But say if this object was actually like a cylinder, like this, if the object was a cylinder and I got rid of this, I got rid of this bottom face and I kind of extruded this and sort of, and just scale that outwards and add add an extra ring loop in there and maybe just bevel that one. So we've got this thing, and let's say we want to stick this to the surface of the object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm going to press Shift S, take the cursor to the base of this object, and then I'm going to set the origin to the 3D cursor, and the Z-axis is still up on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move and I'm going to start snapping it to it, and that's pretty cool. But what if you had an object that is a sphere, and you want to snap this to it? It obviously doesn't work very well. So whereas I can snap that to that nicely, I can't do that with this one. So what you can do with this, if I just make that smooth so you don't have to worry about what the actual surface is, what you can do here is just press on project individual elements, which means if I grab these that I've subdivided and I hold control now while I'm moving that, then it's going to snap that round to the surface. And if I just move that off the surface just a little bit because it's too close, then now I've got something that's morphed to the surface. So I'm going to grab that one as well. So if I get this at the right angle and I grab it and I hit Control, then all of that would be individually snapped. And the opposite effect of that is, say if I did that without saying project individual elements, did I do that without hitting that? Maybe I did. If you do it without it, then the whole thing's going to do some crazy stuff. It's just going to move it like in a way that you don't want. It's not molding with the surface. So what if by doing project individual elements, it's going to move it, and the further, as it's not hitting that anymore, it doesn't know what to do with it. But if it's over it, then it's all going to stretch around the surface, which is pretty cool. And okay, so that's all of those snappings done. Very quick. Volume I never use, and if I try and use it now, I'll probably just not use it very well. I never use it. I don't really know why you'd want to or how that really works, but it is an option, and mess around with it, but I've never used it. I think the final thing that I want to mention was there's some cool stuff, like some people were talking about like how do you do things, say if this was all in a random position like this, and I obviously can't just bring that and flatten it to these two, on a more complex shape. If I wanted to fix this shape specifically, then I would just obviously delete that edge loop, because if I want to line things up. But in this example I can't do that, and I want to still bring this to be completely in line. So I can do the Z-axis really easily. I can grab on the vertex and say project on self, which I turned off earlier, and say grab on the Z-axis and just line it all up. Or I could grab it and snap it over to the actual vertex and try and eyeball it by moving it along. And that doesn't, that can work. Obviously, as we talked about before, I do still have the local rotation on this thing, so I should be able to grab it on its local X, and actually I think I rotated it in edit mode, so I don't have that. And either way, just try and get these in line. It's just, because I can't line them up. I can line it on the Z, but I just can't line it up on all the axes very easily. On a more complex shape. So what you can do is you can actually just get something that is facing the right way, or say you could just duplicate these two vertices and create the line that you wanted, and then put I could put that an extra ring loop onto that, and then snap this to that vertex. So I'm creating a fake object, just a temporary fake object, and then I can use Alt M to remove the doubles by distance, or try and select that through that and just delete it. Or I can say get this face and just try and use that as the local axis. So I can grab the transform and I can actually add a new transform which is based on this face, and I can name that. I could name it calling it axis face because it's the default axis that I want things to be linked to. And as we can see, when I do change to the cursor here, it's now registering that as the right, as in line with that face. So if I select vertex, it's ignoring the world space rotations, and it's doing it all based on that face. So I can grab now by the Shift Shift Z, and it's moving in the right. It's now moving in the right axis, which is not linked to anything other than just something that I've chosen to try and bring everything in line. So now I can grab that on the Shift Z and just snap it to the vertex, and I can actually create this cube again. Obviously, imagine it's a more complex example, but I've snapped it all and it's all lined up. Equally similar things can happen. I'm not sure how well it holds up. If I say I did for this vertex, yeah, because these two are so far apart, I can't do that so easily. But say because they're affecting the tangent of that vertex. But if I maybe beveled it and then just grabbed that edge instead, and I said for the edge to be the position, then it's still not amazing, but I can still use that. I could grab that on the Z, on the local Z, and just say scale it by the, if I hit full stop, I can change it to active element, and I can say scale this, so now it's scaling into the active element point, but only scale it on the Z, and do that by 0, and it's going to move it, or scale it on the Shift Y by 0, and it's going to move it. It's going to just move everything in line, and again we've now got probably not a perfect cube, but it's just a cool way to snap things, and it was something that I found out quite well a few weeks ago, that you can do this sort of thing. I don't know if it's new to 2.8 or not, but I thought that was pretty cool. And I think after zooming through this stuff, that was the final thing that I wanted to mention. So I hope you learned something, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you want to know anything else, then just drop a comment or something like that. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.